In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. Yes, this was the last major battle of the War of 1812, and though most of it was fought after the treaty ending the war had been signed, it still had amazing geopolitical ramifications that most people then and now totally don't give it credit for. That's right, we're talking about the Battle of New Orleans. So here's everything you need to know, and some things you don't, about the Battle of New Orleans. Okay, Battle of New Orleans, let's go for setup here. We're talking December 1814 and January 1815, and it was, in fact, the last major battle of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a war between the British and the Americans, and it was over three things primarily. It was over land in Canada, particularly around the Great Lakes, that the United States thought should be theirs. It was about the British blocking trade with France because they were at war with France, and America was hurting because France was one of their major trade partners, and it was also over the impressment of American citizens into the British Navy to help fight Napoleon. Now, the thing to understand is that both sides in this war are fighting other wars at the time. The British, as we discussed, are in France fighting that nutty Napoleon guy. The Americans are fighting an incredibly bloody battle against the Red Stick coalition of Creek Indians, and this war is just a horrible thing, and it is expensive, and it's been going on for years. So, fighting is at a stalemate up north by Canada, so the British think maybe they can make some inroads into the Mississippi and separate Louisiana from the rest of the United States. Okay, the players here. Andrew Jackson, American Major General, nicknamed Old Hickory. Yes, this is the same Andrew Jackson who would later go on to become the 7th President of the United States, thanks much to the fame he gains at New Orleans. He had just finished subduing the majority of the Creek Indians, and in late 1814, he rushes down to Louisiana to see what he can do to help defend New Orleans against an anticipated British attack. On the British side, we have Alexander Cochrane, Vice Admiral, commander of the British fleet. He was the same guy that directed the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore a couple months earlier. Cochrane's weakness was probably his famous overconfidence. We also have General Edward Pakenham, an Irish-born commander of the British land forces. He was a brave and talented officer, full of good ideas. Unfortunately for the British, he couldn't get Cochrane to listen to most of them. Now, the British want access to the Mississippi, but an American flotilla stands between them and the Pontchartrain Basin, the gateway to Old Man River. So on December 12, 1814, Cochrane's fleet and his companion land force of over 8,000 men anchor in the Gulf of Mexico, and on December 14th, 1,200 British Marines and sailors attacked the American ships in longboats and captured the flotilla. So the Brits are able to establish a beachhead with 1,800 guys, and instead of attacking the city, they wait for reinforcements. Jackson finds out and leads a nighttime raid on December 23rd. The American attack is repelled, but the British suffer losses, and it makes them think twice about just marching into town. This hesitation on the part of the British worked out great for Jackson because he was able to start building a giant earthworks just behind Rodriguez Canal to protect New Orleans. On Christmas, Pakenham arrives on the scene, and on December 28th, he leads a recon in force to feel out the American defenses. When the recon withdraws, the Americans now have a better idea of what they need to do too, and start fortifying their cannons and continue improving the earthworks. So Jackson ends up with a pretty impressive defensive line, with a flank protecting force on the bank of the Mississippi to his right. It sort of looks like a big L. So it takes until early January for Cochrane and Pakenham to get all 8,000 plus British troops in place. Now, ironically, neither side realizes that a peace treaty ending the war has been signed 2 weeks earlier. So, on January 8th, the British begin their main assault on the city against a numerically vastly inferior American force. And it doesn't go well for the British right from the start. 800 British Marines, ordered to cross the Mississippi and take out Jackson's flank along the river, are delayed by more than 12 hours, largely due to the famous overconfidence of Admiral Cochrane. Because of the delay, the main forward assault of the British would be exposed to withering cannon fire from their flank. By the time the British are finally able to subdue the American flank, it's almost light out, and that's not in the plan. But there's a heavy fog, so they press on. Now, this is a lesson in teamwork and how one guy dropping the ball can really mess up the whole operation. One of the greatest disasters that befell the British that day, probably the greatest disaster, can be laid at the feet of one man, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins. He was the commander of the British 44th Infantry Regiment. Mullins was responsible for bringing the ladders and hooks and things, you know, the things you need to cross canals and ditches and scale earthworks. Guess what? He forgot them. Yeah, he just straight up left them behind. So the British are left to struggle the best they can across ditches and canals until something really, really, really bad happens. The fog lifts. What follows is perhaps the most horrific 45 minutes of slaughter in the history of warfare. The British, unable to advance and lacking any kind of cover, received the full force of the American fortified cannons. After a half hour, there's hardly a Brit with any kind of commission to lead who's not either dead or bleeding out at the bottom of some muddy ditch. Pakenham himself is shot twice before finally getting done blown up by American cannon fire, as grape shot rips through his spine and kills him. So literally all the British officers are dead, and the enlisted men, not having any orders to advance or retreat, are just trying to get down in a ditch and pray as they watch their buddies get slaughtered all around them. About 500 British soldiers actually wisely pretend to be dead until the fighting's over, and I have to say, I can't blame them one little bit. Finally, after what must have seemed like forever, a reserve officer makes his way to the front and orders a retreat. When the shooting stops, a third of the British force is either killed, wounded, or captured in a devastating defeat. The Americans suffer only a handful of losses, while the mostly leaderless British pull back to try to regroup. 3 days later, they decide further adventures are not going to be worth it and scrap the whole idea of taking New Orleans. Cochrane, trying to pull a rabbit out of his hat, spends the next 10 days bombarding Fort St. Philip in a last-ditch attempt to gain control of the Mississippi, but he's eventually driven off by the Americans and sympathetic privateers. He then moves on to Mobile, Alabama, and seizes Fort Boyer until news of the American ratification of the Treaty of Ghent reaches him, ending the war and returning the two belligerents to 1811 boundaries. Despite being a seemingly senseless campaign, it actually ended up proving to be very important. First, it soon came to light that Pakenham had been secretly ordered to ignore any peace treaties and keep fighting regardless. But with Pakenham dead and the British land forces diminished, that wouldn't be possible. It also gave birth to a new American confidence that would eventually manifest itself in things like the Monroe Doctrine. The convincing defeat ensured the British abided by the treaty and saved the American economy from ruin, as this was a really, really expensive war and America was tapped. It also propelled Andrew Jackson to fame, which was a major factor in his becoming president. So there you have it. It was the last major conflict of the War of 1812. It was fought almost entirely after the peace treaty ending the war was signed. It provided a great object lesson on teamwork and remembering your ladders. It launched Andrew Jackson to rock star fame, and it instilled a new sense of American confidence that would eventually shape the world. And that's everything you need to know, and some things you don't, about the Battle of New Orleans. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like it and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe and check out our links in the comments below. Thanks again.